Perfect. I think we started. Hello and welcome to this panel discussion on Ethiopian Airlines. Today we have two very special guests who I'm sure the majority of our viewers will know. First we have Tigray Genocide, who's been an incredible intellectual, and he's a writer and a regular host at Takat Media, who've been doing extensive reporting on the war in Tigray and have been pushing the Tigray narrative. Thank you for coming on, Tigray. We also have an excellent analyst and ally, Martin Plaut. Martin has been a research fellow at the Institution of Commonwealth Studies and is a former BBC World Service Africa editor and an author of Understanding Eritrea. We're glad to have you here, Martin.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So I just want to start briefly by giving context on what's been happening and where we're at the moment. So the genocidal war in Tigray has been systematically engineered for years before the war actually began, with bombs and guns. The current regime has enacted various inhumane ways to weaken the Tigrayan people, like obstructing aid, stopping personal protective equipment for coronavirus from going into Tigray, blocking roads. And since November, we've seen bombardments and attacks from the regional, national, and international military bodies on the people of Tigray. The Ethiopian government has called this a law enforcement operation, but the stories on the ground say otherwise. The war in Tigray has been fought in the dark, and we're currently in a communication blackout right now. I myself haven't spoken to my family for a long time now. I think it's the same for many Tigrayans across the world. So we've had things like banks in the region that have been blocked for use. So if you've opened a bank account in Tigray, you can't use it anywhere in Ethiopia. Tigrayan businesses have been closed down, from tiny businesses that sell the Ethiopian staple food, shiro, to large 5-star hotels for silly things like playing Tigrayan music, or just for them being Tigrayan. We've had reports of many Tigrayans being abducted by federal forces without reason. With a population of approximately 7 million people, the war in Tigray was reported to have killed around 150,000 civilians and displaced millions internally. It has taken many people to Sudan as refugees to flee the war. And we know that almost a third of those refugees are children. The genocide has been conducted via weaponized rape and hunger, in addition to ransacked healthcare facilities, mass killings, and war crimes at the hands of the Ethiopian and Eritrean troops. Yes, and we know that there's a figure that came out of the UN Population Fund that 22,500 women would need medical help after being systematically raped. The numbers of the women that would have been sexually abused will have been a lot more than this, because they wouldn't report, and some of them maybe wouldn't need medical help, and so on. The Ethiopian government has continued to ignore and disregard international recommendations and continues to be a massive cause for concern. We saw that 150,000 civilians were killed, but that was a figure that came out a lot early on. And just today, and today's the day 272 since the war in Tigray began, Sudanese officials and media reported bodies coming out of River Takaza, with some gunshot wounds, and some of them burnt. Tigrayans in Humara being attacked And this is the same for Tigrayans across Ethiopia. Now, with regard to this topic of discussion, many of you will be thinking, where does Ethiopian Airlines come into this conflict? Ethiopian Airlines is widely described as the new spirit of Africa, and is a successful airline and a member of the Star Alliance. I just want to state a quote before we begin from the Star Alliance, that they aim to create a respectful, meaningful workplace that fosters high ethical standards, that is free of discrimination and harassment. Now, I think it's time to hear from our panelists. So, Tigray, I'll start with you. As a Tigrayan, what has been your experience of Ethiopian Airlines, prior to this conflict, and where does this successful airlines come into what is currently happening to Tigrayans?
Thanks, Rita. Thanks for organizing this discussion, and thanks for the incredible work that you continue to do for Tigray. We appreciate that. I don't think I have any interesting personal encounter or story with Ethiopian Airlines. I think all my flights with Ethiopian Airlines have been fairly good, not eventful. There was nothing special that happened to me personally. And like you said, the Ethiopian Airlines was one of the success stories during the EPRDF regime. I think at one point it was one of the most profitable organizations in Africa, and overall it was something that was dubbed as a huge success. But even then, even during its heydays, there were rumors that the Ethiopian Airlines had a story and history of discriminating people. So, for instance, people would accuse Ethiopian Airlines of not hiring people if they didn't speak perfect Amharic, for instance. That was one of the attack points that people charged leveled against the Ethiopian Airlines. And there were also talks that Ethiopian Airlines didn't hire people who were from the southern part of Ethiopia, who were dark skinned. So for all the discrimination that it has been doing now, it's not really a new thing. In terms of discriminating people based on their ethnicity and based on their looks, it started way before than the war in Tigray.
Thank you. I think many Tigrayans like yourself flew Ethiopian Airlines with a lot of pride, maybe prior to this war. Always celebrated the fact that Ethiopia had a success story in Ethiopian Airlines, and proudly used them. Martin, I'm interested to know if you've had any personal experiences using Ethiopian Airlines, and how your ideas or opinions may have changed since this war began. I know there's one particular story of a hostess who tragically lost her job at Ethiopian Airlines on Eritrea Focus. I wanted to ask you to go into a bit more detail on that, possible.
Sure. Well, let's take those in bits. Start off with my own personal experience, which has always been extremely good. The Ethiopian Airlines was a very effective carrier, one of the best run airlines in Africa. Used to be in competition with South African Airlines, which was seen as equally good. I'm afraid South African Airlines is now a shadow of what it once was, and is a loss-making organization which can hardly manage to keep going. While as Ethiopian Airlines has been a very profitable airline, its turnover in 2020 was about $4 billion, and it carried something like 12 million passengers. So that is a real success, and there aren't many examples like that in Africa, because every African country as a matter of national pride, insists on having its own airlines, or almost all of them do. And they are huge white elephants, to use an expression. They require huge amounts of cash from the government. They are useless. They are badly maintained. I mean, when I flew for the BBC, there are many airlines that we are told you may not fly on this under any circumstances because they are just so dangerous. And nobody ever even came close to putting Ethiopian Airlines on that list, a bit like Kenyan Airways. They were very good airlines. So, I mean, my experience was always one of great respect for Ethiopian Airlines. And when I traveled around Ethiopia itself, I used it on several occasions, and it was always a very pleasant experience. And my experiences of, being in it, perhaps going out to somewhere like Lalibela, seeing women dressed in, marvelous white robes and wearing all their gold, and going for the Mariam festival, and very warm and very positive experiences. But one has to accept that at the same time it is a part of a national system which is now in deep crisis, and we can come on to that, and I'm happy to talk about that in a minute. But let's just take the question that you specifically asked about the women, because there were not just a few. I must have interviewed perhaps nearly half a dozen people who had worked for Ethiopian Airlines and been pleased to do so, some of them for 10, 15 years. And then when this appalling war broke out, they were forced out of the airline, they were discriminated against, they were one of them effectively ended up being dumped in America and unable to return home. So it is a very, very sad story indeed. And some of them I could name, some of them I couldn't name, some of them didn't even want me to use the information they provided me because they were so worried what would happen to their families back home if this information got out. And there was a time where the chief executive, Mr. Tewolde, was also, frankly, had a very hard time. And I think it was only when his case was highlighted by some of the, I can't remember whether it was Reuters or somebody like that, that broadcast his story, that they were then denied it, and he was forced to say, oh, no, all is well, I'm not being discriminated against. So there was certainly a systematic attempt to get rid of Tigrayan members of staff, and which is just awful. And of course, what they felt was felt all the way across the economy. There were, whether it was the taxi drivers at the airport, whether it was the people who had shops, whether it was people who had hotels, as you mentioned, all of these people then found themselves up against the Ethiopian state, who basically want to, almost force them out of business at almost any cost, or turn them into essentially strangers in their own country. And that was what the women that I spoke to said. All of a sudden, I felt that I was a stranger in my own country. And that is an appalling thing for anybody to find in their own land.
Yeah, I agree. It is appalling. A lot of them were laid off, having to left to fend for themselves, with children and a family to feed. I wonder, Tahlai, if you know of any stories like this.
Thank you, Rita. I think if you don't mind, I would like to make a more fundamental point, and Martin has briefly alluded to it. And it is that every institution, every organization has been commandeered into a stick with which to attack the Tigrayans for the last 8 months, rather. Be it the Ethiopian Airlines, the Ethiopian Telecommunications, the Ethiopian Broadcasting Corporation, and every institution that you could name has been used as a stick with which to beat the Tigrayans. And in that sense, the Ethiopian Airlines an exception. It's just the rule. So that's what happened, and it's something that you would expect. Regarding what it has done against Tigrayans, I know, for instance, for a fact that as soon as the war started, I think it was 1 week or 2 weeks later, it summarily dismissed Tigrayans from work without giving any specific reason. They told them to stay at home, and their payment and their contract was terminated. And they weren't given any specific reason, but it doesn't take a genius to figure out that it was because of their ethnicity. So that's one of the things that they have done. And they later dismissed hostesses, like the story, the typical story that Martin detailed for us now. And I know of similar stories of other hostesses and pilots who were paid from the airlines. And the other thing that it did against Tigrayans was, I don't know if I should attribute that to the airlines itself or to the airport, because they have different structure. The airport is owned and controlled by a different entity to the airlines, but they prevented ethnic Tigrayans from boarding planes, from leaving the country. And again, there, when they asked why they were being turned away, the only reason they were given was the order came from above, and that they didn't know why they were being turned away. But I don't know if we will go into detail later, but then it went on to, now we have things for which we have concrete evidence that the airlines would use to transport troops to battlefronts and to transport weapons as well. But maybe I will mention that later when we go into details.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be great. I just wanted to highlight that it was the New York Times who reported that the CEO of the national carrier Ethiopian Airlines,
that's right. I'd forgotten the source. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, exactly. And they stated that he was stopped from boarding a plane, a flight earlier in the war, and was put under house arrest. Just to continue from what Tigray was saying, I wanted to ask, you know, there's a common misconception that the war on Tigray was started by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, especially in the beginning. Tigray, can you maybe tell us about the facts and where Ethiopian Airlines participation was in this?
Well, so regarding who started the war, the claim that the war was started by the TPLF has been made only by the government, right? And we know by now that the government has lied 99 times out of 100 times. And on that ground alone, one could dismiss that claim. But if you scratch beneath the surface and look into the evidence as to what transpired in the days and months before the war, one of the things that the Prime Minister said in the aftermath of the TPLF election, or rather the Tigray government election held, I think it was in September, was that if the TPLF didn't accept his orders, his diktats, he was going to engage them militarily. And on multiple other occasions, he said that war was always coming. That is before the war started. And a couple of months ago in Parliament, for instance, one of the things he said was that the war had already been planned with Eritreans and with other entities. And that the only way that the war could have been avoided was if the TPLF had joined the Prosperity Party, right? So there was no way that the war could have been avoided without the TPLF accepting and acceding to all the demands that he was making. So in terms of who started the war, I don't think any sensible person would say the TPLF started the war. What could have happened, and I don't have a problem accepting this, is the TPLF or forces allied with the TPLF could have shot the first bullet in the 3rd or 4th of November. That could have happened. But whether they did that or didn't, the war was always coming. Now, the role of Ethiopian Airlines in starting the war, I don't think there is anything that we could attribute to the Ethiopian Airlines except that it accepted everything that the federal government told them to do or not to do. I think that's the only thing that we could say as regards the Ethiopian Airlines.
Yeah, and thank you, Tahlai. I was referring to, you're absolutely right, but I was referring to the transportation of soldiers very early on into Mekelle Airport by the Ethiopian Airlines, and how that was a massive factor in the
So we don't,
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have concrete evidence that the Ethiopian Airlines transported troops when the war started, but we have evidence that I think about 2 or 3 months ago, for instance, it transported troops and weapons from actually from Eritrea, from Musuwa. Those allegations for which I could produce evidence, but I don't know if on the 4th and 3rd of November and about those times the Ethiopian Airlines was involved. I couldn't be quite sure.
Okay. Yeah, there were reports coming out of Mekelle around that period that stated things like that around Mekelle Airport. So just to state some more of the ethnic profiling that would happen across Ethiopia, we receive incident reports at Tigray Network, and we would hear things like British nationals would be targeted for being ethnically Tigrayan. They weren't allowed to board flights. They would be harassed and interrogated without reason, purely for being Tigrayan. They would the Ethiopian Airlines staff would tell them things like, "You're not. We can do whatever we want now. You're not somebody that deserves respect," and target their dignity and things like that. We've had reports from the Telegraph that reported that the staff were targeted and fired, just like you guys have been saying. The BBC have also reported fears of ethnic profiling and highlighted that Ethiopian Airlines may be one of the organizations that did this. As a result of all of these human rights violations, hundreds of thousands of people worldwide engaged in a campaign to boycott Ethiopian roses back in February around Valentine's Day, because these roses were carried by Ethiopian Airlines and were a massive source of income for Ethiopia as a state. Martin, we saw you participate heavily in this campaign, like the rest of us, and I believe you reported that the Ethiopian Airlines actually responded to you. What was the intention, would you say, behind that campaign, and what conclusions were you able to draw from the campaign?
Well, I think the campaign was trying to draw attention to the fact that you can't, there isn't when there's a war like this, which is obviously, appalling. And the, people are dying in their thousands, and a whole region of a country is being held hostage, and frankly, the government is attempting to starve it to death. Then, frankly, you have to treat the country as a whole as one unit. And when there is part of that country which is bringing in huge quantities of foreign reserves, which is exactly what Ethiopian Airlines does by carrying foreign passengers and by carrying cargo, then you have to say, well, that is part of a system which, even if it didn't carry a single member of the armed forces, and I'm not saying whether it did or didn't, even if it never did, it would be part of a system which should be supporting the war effort, because it is providing the hard currency which is required in order to purchase new weapons, new ammunition, new drones. That is money is the lifeblood of a war. And this is as true for Ethiopia as it is for any country. And the fact that Prime Minister Abiy has been able to keep this war going as long as he has, I mean, for the Tigrayans, this isn't such an issue because, you know, their source of weaponry is the weapons they capture from the Ethiopian military. They don't have an external source of weaponry, as far as I know. You know, they have no way of getting anything in, so they have to capture it, or they don't have any. But for the Ethiopian military, for all the militia, they have to be resupplied and rearmed, and that has to be paid for, because arms dealers do not accept blank checks. They want hard currency, and the organizations that are earning that hard currency, well, one of them is Ethiopian Airlines. And as you mentioned, they facilitate another major earner, which is the flowers, which are exported by Ethiopian Airlines or carried, even if they are from Kenya, to Europe, because Ethiopian Airlines has contracts for all those kind of things. So we basically launched a campaign around Valentine's Day earlier in the year, basically saying to the supermarkets, florists in the West, please do not stock Ethiopian Airlines or Ethiopian roses or roses which are carried by Ethiopian Airlines. And we contacted Ethiopian Airlines and they got really upset about this. I mean, they really were unhappy about the fact that we were putting out a lot of social media. I mean, it was, Rita and other people, your colleagues, produced some really excellent material, and we shared it around the world, and it got a lot of coverage. And this must have hurt Ethiopian Airlines. I mean, the one thing I think I've learned from that is that we launched it too late. So the orders were probably placed months before that. Let's say, it's probably 6 months before the actual date that the supermarkets place their orders. And in a sense, if we're going to start doing the same campaign or a similar campaign for next Valentine's Day, we should not only target the public, but we should also target the buyers. And those buyers you can't expect them to change the orders like 6 weeks, a month beforehand. We need to get to them much earlier so that they avoid purchasing roses from Ethiopia, who produce very nice roses. I'm not criticizing Ethiopian roses, but they are part of a war system because they are earning hard currency, which is buying the bullets, the shells, the rockets, the drones, which are being fired at ordinary men and women throughout Tigray and are killing children and innocent civilians, as well as, of course, troops. But I mean, that once you're part of a war system, that's what you're doing. And I think it's unconscionable.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking about the email that you received from them after that campaign, sort of denying everything that was happening. Would you say what you received was symptomatic of a company that valued honesty, that were honest and that were willing to be open and transparent, or otherwise?
I think it was a company under pressure.
Yeah.
What you'd expect. I mean, people deny anything that is in any way that they can. They of course denied that there was any discrimination and that everybody was treated fairly and equally. But I knew this wasn't the case because I'd spoken to the people themselves. And why would they lie about it? Why would they tell me that they'd lost their jobs and that their families were in difficulties? No, yes, of course, well, one should report what Ethiopian Airlines says, because I'm a journalist. I report both sides of the story if I can, but I think it was pretty clear who was telling the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as well as us, the rest of the Tigrayans and yourself, as a part of Eritrea Focus and other groups. I know other Eritreans participated in this campaign and in in asking the world also to boycott Ethiopian Airlines. Was that for a specific reason? Were Eritreans being targeted as far as you knew?
I don't think Eritreans were necessarily being targeted, but there's been a strong feeling, particularly in the abroad in the diaspora, that the Eritrean people know how badly they've been treated by their government. They know the role of President Isaias in prosecuting this war and supporting Prime Minister Abiy in fighting it. You know, they felt very strongly that they should stand with the Tigrayan people in their hour of need, because, you know, the Tigrayan people have been generously hosting 100,000 Eritrean refugees. And although there have been some criticisms in the last couple of weeks about, you know, that some people have been attacked, you know, and that needs to be dealt with. On the whole, in the main, the Tigrayan people have been enormously generous to the Eritreans, and the Eritrean people do not forget it. And after all, you know, what divides Tigrayans and Eritreans? I mean, next to nothing. I mean, many of them are of the same families. So, of course, they're going to stand together. And nobody likes a dictatorship. So, I mean, I think there are good reasons why the Eritrean population wanted to support people. And, you know, I mean, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's currently talks in Sudan between various Eritrean opposition movements who've been badly divided in the past. And there is the prospect now of some kind of unity now that may succeed, that may not succeed. But let's hope it does, because that would not just strengthen the Eritrean position, it would strengthen the Tigrayan position as well, which, you know, because those people will stand with you and be united and try to halt this appalling war, which is just devouring lives and ruining, you know, the futures of so many people which is utterly unnecessary.
Yes, for sure. We've definitely seen some amazing allies on the Eritrean side, and we have all the similarities, as you said. Some of us share families, but as well as that, from the reports that we've been taking, we've heard of a lot of Eritreans being targeted specifically because they speak Tigrinya, because they're Tigrinya speakers at these airports. I wonder, do you have anything to say on this, Tahle?
From the little information I have about this, generally what happens is if they spot any Tigrinya speaker, they arrest them, but later they could tell them apart by their accents, and the Eritreans generally immediately released, and the Tigrayans kept. That's what generally happens, but there could be specific exceptional cases, but in general, I think that is a trend.
Okay, so that goes to show that this campaign is specifically against Tigrayans. Yeah, and so the past week, since the last campaign in February on the Ethiopian Roses and Ethiopian Airlines, and this past week we've had a second round of campaign where we've used the hashtags boycott Ethiopian Airlines and defund Tigray Genocide, and it has had mass exposure. Hundreds of thousands of people have seen this and has been exposed to this hashtag. This campaign was in collaboration with Tigrayan organizations across Europe and the world, namely Tigray Unity Germany, the Tigrayan Association in France, Giovanni Tigrini Italiani, Tigray Youth Holland, Tigray Youth Belgium, Tigray Relief Sweden, Tigray Youth Network UK, and the Tigray Youth Movement in Sweden, and lastly, Youth Tigray in Norway. So a lot of organizations have participated in this campaign because of the vast human rights violations. And this campaign has actually been quite successful because we've seen in the last couple of days that the Ethiopian Airlines have responded with a statement stating some very questionable things. The first paragraph of their statement says, Ethiopian Airlines strongly refutes all the recent baseless and unfounded allegations that are running on social media regarding the airline's involvement in transporting armament and soldiers to the Tigray region. Tigray, if I can have you step in on this, is this a reflection of the federal government's agenda? And what parallels have you seen between them and this statement that has been put out?
So generally, every accusation that we have made against the government has been met with exactly the same statement, right? So first, we accuse the Eritrean government, the Ethiopian government, of inviting Eritrean troops, or at least of letting Eritrean troops enter Tigray. And we knew that because we had the evidence. And what was the statement that the government issued? The exact denial statement that you read now, Rita. And when we accused the government of having committed atrocities in Aksum and in other places, they issued exactly the same statement, and countless other accusations was responded with exactly the same statement. And it doesn't surprise me that the Ethiopian Airlines has also resorted to the exact same trick by providing blanket denials of all allegations. But the most interesting part for me was one of the serious allegations that people made against the airlines was that it was, number one, transporting troops to certain areas, not necessarily to Tigray, because they couldn't fly to Tigray. So nobody was really saying that the Ethiopian Airlines had transported troops to Tigray. But one of the points that they emphasize is that they say that they didn't fly to Tigray, but nobody had accused them of doing that in the first place. And the other accusation, and this is something that I have concrete evidence for, Ethiopian Airlines had been transporting cargo from outside Ethiopia, from Eritrea, for instance, into certain places. And this is against regulations of the Ethiopian Airlines. Normally, cargo had to stop in Addis Ababa, and there has to be a check in Addis Ababa, and then only then could it transport to other areas. But in break with tradition, over the last couple of months, they have been transporting cargo from overseas, including from Eritrea, directly into certain places like Gondar and Bahar Dar, and then from Gondar and Bahar Dar, they take them to Samara, from where they distribute them to other places. So these are things for which we have conclusive evidence. But the Ethiopian Airlines offered a blanket denial, and I think there is no sensible person that would be shocked or surprised by the nature of the statement, because that is the exact kind of statement that the regime has been using for the last 8 months now.
Yeah, I wonder, Martin, do you have any comments on this statement? Have you?
I mean, I agree with you. I mean, the Ethiopian government denied flatly that there were any Eritrean troops in Tigray, and then said that I remember a statement saying they were going to withdraw. They were about to withdraw. They were withdrawing. It was happening. It hasn't happened. I mean, I think they have withdrawn in some areas, but I think, quite frankly, that's partly because of TDF offensives rather than wishing to withdraw. And as far as I know, they are still in some areas in the far north, as well as being possibly involved in parts of Oromia, where they're said to be Eritrean special forces, as well as being, having some security agents in Addis Ababa itself. So I mean, that was just, frankly, a plain falsehood that was put out by the Ethiopian government. And if you start putting out those kind of claims and which are blatantly untrue, then really you don't have much credibility. I mean, you may remember that Prime Minister Abiy said that there was no hunger in Tigray. You may remember him saying that this was going to be a very short campaign and it was just a law and order issue. I mean, this is not a man who is, shall we say, a stranger to falsehoods.
Yeah. So in light of that, I just want to share some pictures that have been going around on social media. So you can see Ethiopian Airlines transporting some soldiers somewhere, and these are quite shameless pictures. They seem to be boasting, showing off. And this is some pictures of the cargo. To finish the statement, what they finished off with was that we would like to underline that Ethiopian Airlines has not transported any weapon or soldier to Tigray. And as Tigray said, this is potentially like a legal cover-up for later on, the specifying that it's to Tigray. So again, Star Alliance has stated that they aim to create a respectful and meaningful workplace that fosters high ethical standards, that is free of discrimination and harassment. Martin, what do you think is their future while being cemented in a campaign that is violating human rights?
Well, I mean, if they were the only organization, the only country whose airline engaged in that, I mean, there would not be many airlines flying. I mean, just to take one example, look at the way that the Saudis treat quite a lot of the people that live in their country, half of them being women. Or if you were a Christian in Saudi Arabia, you would be very poorly treated. But I mean, Saudi Airlines, makes a lot of money and does pretty well. So I mean, the real problem is it's difficult to get across the idea that it's really wrong to fly with these kind of organizations and be involved in the in relationships with them. You have to really work hard at this, and it takes a long time. I mean, we appealed, for example, to the United Nations and to the aid agencies not to use Ethiopian Airlines, and very few of them were prepared to engage with us on this. And I mean, perhaps this is something we should take up again and say, that people like Oxfam, Save the Children, UNICEF can't really go around saying that they are worried about the impact of a policy of starvation on an entire region and entire people, and then happily board the airline whose activities are funding the war. And I think we need to begin to make that claim perhaps a bit more loudly, and to make it public. I mean, maybe that's one of the things that we should take ways that we should take this forward now. I mean, we've made the direct allegation, or you've made the direct allegation about about troops being carried, if not directly to Tigray, into the war zones and to be used in the war that's continuing. You've also pointed out the discrimination, and I think there's no doubt about that. There's lots of evidence of that. Perhaps we now need to begin to say, to have a more high-profile campaign about these international organizations, saying it is unacceptable to go around using an airline whose funds are supplying the weapons that are falling upon the people of this region. Perhaps that's the next step forward.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's not just Star Alliance or just Ethiopian Airlines. We've seen telecommunications that have been weaponized in Tigray, in that we've not heard from our family members all this time. We can't call home. And organizations or groups like Vodafone and CDC, who British taxpayers actually pay for, have had no qualms about making deals with the genocidal regime in Ethiopia. Tigray, do you have any comments on this?
Well, regarding the Star Alliance that the Ethiopian Airlines is a member of, in principle, the alliance is an association of commercial aviation industries, and any aviation industry that engage in military activity should be immediately expelled. There shouldn't be any doubt, at least in principle. But we have learned over the last 8 months now that some people are more than happy to bypass principle in favor of profit or political expediency. And I think that is the main problem that we have been facing. But like Martin said, we carry on campaigning and advocating for what we believe should be done and is right. But about Vodafone, you reminded me of a story of what they did when people started raising concerns. They went on blocking spree, and they blocked everybody who raised and asked questions on Twitter. That was quite a scene to witness.
Yeah, for sure. And I know protesters,
perhaps.
sorry. And I know when protesters in London went to the Vodafone offices and asked for them to not make this deal and for them to accept a letter from the Tigrayans, they refused them and turned them away. So yeah, they've been quite difficult in this process, I think. So the fate of Ethiopian Airlines doesn't seem so bad right now, but should we continue to hold them accountable and continue to campaign against human rights violations, hopefully it won't be great, you know. Hopefully these organizations will be held accountable. What would you say, do you have any comments on what organizations like this that fund regimes that do such things would be in the end? Do you think they will be held accountable?
Who are you asking?
You can go, Martin.
Well, let's put it this way. All these organizations, the corporations, spend huge sums of money on advertising and on nurturing their image. They are very aware that they are open to any kind of accusation which taints their image. Now, they're not spending this money for fun. They do it because it is important to their brand and to making them part of a successful organization, and one that they can then go to the international money markets. They can borrow money, and they can do so at a decent rate because they're seen as a respectful, successful company. If that begins to be tarnished, then they will, it will begin to erode their position and make it life much more difficult for them. So I personally think one shouldn't try and hit every organization under the sun, because you dilute your message after a while. But I think if you've decided that you're going to target some of the big players and go for Ethiopian Airlines and maybe Vodafone or Vodacom, I mean, yes, but then go for them and keep at it and keep raising it, and also raise it, as I said, with the organizations who are using it, and make it to the point where they really have to think seriously about whether they will want to go on supporting it. And then gradually from that, it'll become much more difficult for other organizations to continue to support and to use the airlines. And that's the only way of doing it. It's a long, slow process. But I worked on the anti-apartheid campaign for many years, and we started off with oranges. And there were some images of an orange made to look like the head of a little black child who was being crushed, to be squeezed for the juice. And that was a very successful image that was used against oranges from South Africa. And after a while, the supermarkets stopped, or if they didn't stop buying them, then they had a preference, shall we say, for oranges from Spain or from somewhere else. And that was success, because gradually it became more and more difficult for South Africa to raise money on the international money markets, because a lot of the pension funds eventually said, well, we don't really want to be associated with apartheid. Well, if this war continues, and I certainly hope that it does not continue, but if this war continues and becomes a long-term campaign, then in a sense you have to associate organizations like Ethiopian Airlines with raising funds, transporting troops, providing munitions for a regime that is killing and crushing innocent men, women, and children. And that, I think, is the image that needs to be got across if this is going to work.
Thank you. And Tigray, what would you say to organizations like the Star Alliance and other organizations that may want to fund such regimes and possibly to general population on this?
Well, I think I will emphasize the story that Martin told us about the story from South Africa, and that is that sometimes our efforts and campaigns may take time, but it doesn't mean that they won't bear fruit eventually. And what I will say now is every organization and everybody who was involved in the Tigray genocide will finally be held accountable. That's for sure. No one will be allowed to get away with murder, and people have been murdered, and I think organizations should stick up to some principles and stop funding and working with regimes who are killing people in their thousands and subjecting people to mass starvation. If anything, they are bringing shame to themselves, and that would be my message to them.
Thank you, Tigray. So yeah, with great effort and consistency, we will hopefully hold everybody that was responsible for the Tigray genocide accountable. And yeah, I would just like to finish off on what you can do, our viewers, on this, and to help us hold them accountable. So one, you can be a part of the Twitter campaign or the campaigns generally whenever they're on. You can find tweets at tigraynetwork.org, omnatigray.org, and standwithtigray.com. You can use your voices, raise awareness on social media on what's happening in Tigray using the hashtags defund Tigray genocide, boycott Ethiopian Airlines. You can contact your local representatives and companies that work with Ethiopian Airlines and alert them of their complicity in supporting the ongoing war and discrimination against Tigrayans. You can abstain from flying Ethiopian Airlines and buying Ethiopian roses until investigations are complete and the genocide committed against the Tigrayans and the war in Tigray is over. I just want to ask lastly if you guys have any last comments on the current events taking place across Ethiopia and in Tigray. Martin, would you like to go first? Do you have any?
Well, clearly the situation is developing very fast, and it's really tough to keep up with what is happening with the both on the battlefield, with reports that Lalibela has either been captured or bypassed, and in order not to damage the historic city. Clearly, the offensive in the Amhara region is moving really fast. There have, as we mentioned earlier, the terrible pictures of bodies floating down the river, which is awful. We have the Samantha Powers, who is the American USAID person who is coming to Addis if she isn't there already. And that is really important. And there's one report that I see in the last hour in fact suggesting that Prime Minister Abiy has now accepted an initiative from the Sudanese Prime Minister for mediation to stop the war in Tigray. Now, if that is true, and I have no evidence that it is true, but if it is true, that is a very substantial development, because of course he refused to accept, you remember, the mediation efforts which were brought about by President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, which was agreed way back in, I think it was in November last year. So if that has happened, and as I say, it needs to be confirmed, I can't confirm it, then that is a really significant development. And I'm sure that it's one that he would not have wished to accept if he hadn't been under enormous pressure. The final thing I would say is that there are suggestions which I've heard, and again, I'm sorry that these are not, it's nothing that I would report as a member of the BBC, but I have heard rumors of divisions between the Prime Minister Abiy and President Isaias. Now, again, I cannot stand these up. They are just, whispers in the wind at the moment. But there's clearly, what I think all this shows us is that there's a lot going on. And in the end, it comes down to one simple fact: because you haven't been crushed and are on the offensive. If you were not on the offensive and were crushed, none of this would be happening.
Thank you, Martin. Tigray?
I think there's one thing that has been begging in Ethiopia for the last 8 months, and that is for one person in Addis Ababa or in Bahar Dar to stand up and say, war, whatever the problem, war isn't the answer. I think at least one person in Addis Ababa or in Bahar Dar or in Adama or whatever that is, should stand up and say that and do the right thing and be on the right side of history. It's shocking to me that there hasn't been that person up until now, and even today it would never be too late to say that. And I implore, I urge whomever is listening to us to do that. We have to stop this horrific war and end the human suffering and devastation.
Thank you, Martin. Sorry, not Martin, Tigray. Some great points there. I want to highlight just before we end that Tigrayans have grafted for the success of Ethiopian Airlines from the beginning, from the time of Haile Selassie until now, to make it a success. And I want to highlight that we shouldn't neglect the people of Tigray across Ethiopia, just because TDF have taken Ma'ala and other regions in Ethiopia and other regions in Tigray. And there's currently a campaign using the hashtag Humera Massacre because of the Tigrayans that are being targeted in Humera. That they're in danger. They're being killed, burned, harassed. So let's not neglect them, and everybody that's watching this, please join that campaign and use hashtag Humera Massacre. I want to thank both panelists, Tigray and Martin, and the audience in general for coming on and listening to us, and remind you all not to use Ethiopian Airlines until the genocide that's been committed against Tigrayans has been fully investigated and they stop participating in it. So yeah, have a good evening and a good day, depending on wherever you are. Yeah, thank you so much. End it here.
Cheers. Thanks.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye, Martin.